Make sure you subscribe and like. And we're going to dive into the JU-87 Stuka, so make sure you grab your popcorn and enjoy. At the start of the war, JU-87 was obsolete, vulnerable, and technologically behind. The JU-87B was intended to be the last model ever made. The Stuka dropped the first bombs of the war on September 1st, 1939 with the invasion of Poland, and did the final Luftwaffe ground assault on May 4th, 1945. Prior to World War II, the JU-87 was used in the Spanish Civil War, but was used sparingly. The JU-87 was known for its Jericho Trompetin sirens that was a speed indicator for pilots while diving. The Stuka's underwing dive brakes, a Hugo Junkers invention, were remarkably effective despite their small size and simplicity. The airplane's bluff chin radiator, large wheel pants, upright greenhouse, and general avoidance of drag reduction sufficed to maintain a 365 mph vertical dive speed. Later models could dive up to 405 miles per hour. Stuka pilots also had half a protractor's worth of angle lines etched in red into the right-hand side of the canopy window. When matched with the horizon, that gave them their dive angles. Another unusual Stuka feature was a large window in its belly between the pilot's feet so that he could always keep an eye on the target as he prepared to roll into his dive. One of the JU-87's advanced features, at least for that era, was an automatic pull-out mechanism to avoid the possibility of pilots being overcome by target fixation or rendered unable to fly by the effects of high G pull-outs. It was a simple hydraulic device. Once the pilots had trimmed nose down for the dive, and to counteract the increased airspeed, it released the trim setting when the ordnance was pickled and reset the tab to command a pull-out that typically ran to between 5 and 6 Gs. Allied pilots who opposed Stukas didn't bother trying to catch them in a dive. They waited until the Germans released their bombs and pulled out. JU-87s were intended to operate only where the Luftwaffe had complete air superiority and could make bombing runs with impunity. Nobody ever meant for them to go head-to-head with 8 gun Spitfires and Hurricanes, one with Mustangs and many other Allied fighters. After the Battle of Britain, the RAF proclaimed that the Stuka was finished as an offensive weapon, beaten bloodily by Spitfires and Hurricanes. During the 5 years after the Battle of Britain, the RAF's pronouncement, the hundreds of thousands of tons of merchant shipping and warships sunk, and thousands of Soviet tanks destroyed, made it obvious that the JU-87 could still get the job done. Stuka pilots quickly learned to attack ships from astern, so they could easily follow a ship's evasive actions. They often dove on a ship at a 45-degree angle and fired the machine guns at the bow as a telltale sign. While the RAF was dismissing the Stuka as an irrelevant after its poor showing of the Battle of Britain, JU-87s essentially destroyed the Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet. Stuka UHF radios were mounted in tanks and other armored vehicles and were manned by Luftwaffe officers schooled in ground support tactics. They then directed strikes by Stukas overhead against any target impeding the Panzer's advance. The JU-87G, one of the most effective Stuka models, was no longer a dive bomber and didn't even have dive brakes. The G was armed with huge 37mm 12-round anti-tank cannons underneath the wings. The cannons used the barrels and receivers of cumbersome flak guns that dated back to World War I, but they were potent against Soviet T-34 tanks. Firing one tungsten cord explosive round at a time required a precise gunner. T-34s were most vulnerable from astern, where there was little armor and lots of gas. The Stuka was finally reaching the end of its useful life. At the beginning of World War II, a JU-87 had a life expectancy of 10.5 months. By 1941, it was little better than half that, and as Soviet fighters found their groove after the disastrous first months of Operation Barbarossa, the Stuka could expect to live just over 4 days of combat. There is only 2 Stukas left in the world that are in museums. One is fairly close to Wisconsin. It's the Museum of Natural Science and History in Chicago, Illinois. I am planning a trip to go down there and see it. I'll be sure to make a video when I do so, and maybe redo this video. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully y'all enjoyed. The picture on the screen right now is the Jericho siren that the pilots used. They used it as an indicator when they were going down into the dive of how fast their airspeed was just off the sound. It actually became a nuisance to the pilots and the people on the ground, and eventually the Germans did away with it. It did have a psychological effect on some of the enemies, but as the war progressed, obviously it had little to no effect, and later Stukas eventually didn't have any at all. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully you learned something.